Olá a todos, boa tarde, sejam muito bem-vindos aí a uma sequência, essa nossa parceria aí com a Vancouver Film School. Eu estou aqui hoje com muitas novidades para vocês. Quero apresentar inicialmente aqui quem está com a gente aqui. Eu vou começar aqui por cima aqui. O Paulo vai ajudar a gente a fazer a tradução. Olha só, gente, hoje a gente vai ter aqui a palestra do Christopher, que vai falar um pouquinho sobre o programa de Game Design da Vancouver Film School. E a gente vai ter tradução simultânea do Daniel Lucena por o link que está na descrição desse vídeo. Então, se você quer assistir a versão com a tradução, o link está aqui embaixo na descrição do vídeo, é só acessar. O professor Lipão vai ser o nosso interlocutor hoje aqui, vou ficar nos bastidores, e eu trago de novo aqui a Daiane e o Júnior, que são os representantes aqui, que estão no escritório Vancouver Film School, aqui em São Paulo. Obrigado por articular. A Daiane e o Júnior, eles sempre estão trazendo coisas novas para a gente, e a Daiane e o Júnior vão falar sobre o programa de bolsas depois que o Christopher encerrar a fala dele, que vai durar uma média aí de mais ou menos meia hora, e aí a gente vai abrir um pouquinho para uns 10 minutos de perguntas, tá? Então prepara as perguntas no chat, o professor Lipão vai fazer a conversão aqui, tá? Welcome, Christopher. Welcome to PUC Minas.
Oh, thank you.
Bem-vindo a PUC Minas, Christopher. É um prazer estar aqui.
Okay. Does everybody hear me okay? Just checking.
Pronto.
There we go. All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Okay.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me here today. So I am Christopher Mitchell. I've been in the game industry for a long time now. That says 15 years. It probably should say 20 years by now, in fact. And I've worked as sort of a writer and designer, both technical designer and sort of like other facets as well, a bunch of video game companies. But I've spent about the last 10 years or so working at Vancouver Film School, first as an instructor and now as head of department for game design and also programming. So I sort of manage those two disciplines here at the school. And generally speaking, I'm pretty well versed in sort of the state of the game industry. So if there's questions about sort of related industries, so perhaps things like 3D animation or UI UX development inside the games industry, please do feel free to ask me questions. The worst I'll do is connect you with somebody smarter than me. Now, a long time ago, like properly a couple decades ago, I was supposed to be a lawyer. And luckily that didn't happen. I wound up a game developer instead, which is great because I would have been a terrible lawyer. Like everybody would have gone to jail or lost all their money or whatever. And these days, in addition to working at VFS, actually, before I get to that, I suppose I'll cover this. Here's a couple games I worked on in the past as both a writer and designer here, a couple console titles I worked on. And when I speak with people, when I talk with students, I want to be as sort of brutally honest as possible about sort of the industry and, kind of career prospects and things like that. And I'll try to kind of prove that honesty now. So on the left here, I've got one of my games. And if I zoom in here on the box, you'll see that, like the water and the fire hydrant, like don't even line up. So there's millions and millions of copies of this mistake, like out there in the world. And hopefully now that I've seen this, we'll take that as proof about my honesty here. And something I really like about working at VFS, of course, is that, my students go on to have good careers, right? Like if you go look inside LinkedIn or something like this, you'll find my alumni, my former students working on, the sorts of titles that I have posted here. And indeed, generally speaking, you can sort of, do a search for the game company you're interested in and VFS, and you'll find my former students there, which is always really, really cool. It's tremendously heartening just for me as an instructor. Generally speaking, my students work in Vancouver and sort of the greater Vancouver area. But, in this sort of remote world, that's becoming, less true than it used to be, right? I'm getting sort of more remote students being hired for studios, either in America or whatnot. So, for example, Sony Santa Monica Studios right now is an American company that's doing this big drive for international recruiting because suddenly everybody had to become an expert in remote work for, unsurprising reasons. Now, I'm going to talk about a variety of design concepts today. What I'm really talking about, though, is sort of the idea of taking advantage of user expectations inside design. That's kind of like the broad principle that I want to talk to. And it's something that as a designer, I use every day. Sort of this idea that when you're building a team and making a game, you have an extra budget to play with. Like you have your budget of money, of course, and you have your budget of time. And then we have this budget of sort of user expectations that we're going to play with. But before I get there, I'm going to talk about sort of some general principles here too. One of the most important things a game designer can do, of course, is get into the habit of failing as quickly as possible, like testing your ideas and failing as quickly as possible here. So, you know, we test some sort of concept that we have, we analyze the results in an impartial way, and then we adjust the design over and over and over again, always trying to sort of reinforce the fun. And this is a difficult habit for designers to get into, because oftentimes junior designers have this idea that they're going to, you know, kind of create from whole cloth the perfect game design and then explore that design and then just build it, you know, then we'll assemble 100 people and make the game. When the reality is we're going to be discovering small little emergent moments and then reinforcing those in useful ways and sort of following the fun. So an example I like using is, let's say the developers want to make this slow-paced tactical experience where they're trying to rescue hostages. And then they discover in testing that users like taking a shotgun in each hand and kicking in the door and, you know, shooting the hostages. Well, okay, great. We now have to revise the design to account for the way that users are just interacting with the product in a different way. And it's a challenging thing, but it's a lot of fun for a developer too. Here's a little example of this. So say we're working on a racing game and we have ideas of this being, you know, a very realistic racing simulator. And it's all about kind of getting best times and sort of winning the races and as quickly as we possibly can. And then we discover that users just like crashing. You know, users like crashing all day long. And of course, that's basically the Burnout franchise, you know, which is a franchise I really, really enjoyed. And then they gave the user the ability to even like steer the car during crashes and do sort of greater damage. That's really good game design. That's really good. They've noticed emergence within their game. And when I say emergence, I mean user-created goals. You know, emergence is one of the best things that can happen inside a game. And then as developers, we want to encourage emergence and then reward it as much as we can. So we're trying to find these little fun moments and then reinforce them rather than trying to over-architect our experiences. This is really different from working in film or something like this, where usually you have like, you know, lofty artistic goals and incredibly strong direction from moment to moment. Now, there's some sort of basic terminology we should probably cover here. This is standard in the industry, I would say, right? But some of these points are perhaps a little fuzzy, like fuzzier than they should be. So we have to be a bit careful about this, in that we have mechanics we have to deal with, we have dynamics that we have to deal with, and then we have aesthetics. And users and developers interact with these things in different ways here. So when I say mechanics, I mean just the individual components of the game. So the fact that I push an X button and I jump is a mechanic. The fact that a game is turn-based or real-time, those are both mechanics. The fact that a game has hit points, you know, the user can take damage or can recover from damage or die. These are mechanics. They're things to be considered. Then we get dynamics, which are the things everybody gets wrong all the time, including students, I should point out, like my own students sometimes too, where these are cycling loops of the game. So typically very small little loops, like let's say 5 seconds or 10 seconds of gameplay here. They're skill gated, which is to say the user's raw ability at whatever is difficult within the game is the thing that, you know, causes success or failure within the game here. And these have to be interesting choices and they have to have interesting failures. And the reason I highlight interesting failures is because most of what a user does inside a video game is fail, right? At the end of the day, you try to do an action, fail, the dynamic repeats itself. You try to do an action, fail, the dynamic repeats itself over and over and over and over again. And generally speaking, developers think too much on sort of rewarding success and not enough about making sure that failure is interesting. Because if failure is most of what a user does, we should be thinking about how we are making failure acceptable to the user. Now, acceptable is a squishy word, of course. It can mean anything here. But in this sense, I mean, we're making the user not blame the developer for their failures. So we are contextualizing the failures within the game itself. And then we're also making sure that just the failure reinforces the theme and the aesthetics of the game itself. And then speaking of aesthetics, this is the target emotional state of the game. So for example, this was a game that was worked on at Radical many years ago. So a game where the player feels like a little kid stealing cookies. Like that's the emotional target we're trying to reach over the course of the production here. And it's it's a challenging thing, but a good aesthetic is an excellent way of sort of focusing teams. Now, when players interact with games, what they do is, they push some buttons on a controller, right? And in pushing buttons on the controller, they're going to discover the mechanics of the game. Hopefully, they're going to discover all the mechanics of the game on their own. We don't need to tutorialize anything. It's basically a best case scenario. Via these mechanics, they're going to encounter some sort of dynamic, which is to say, some sort of cycling choice that goes on inside the game here. And then based off of those cycling choices, they reach the aesthetic of the game. They reach the target emotional state, whatever we want that target emotional state to be. Developers do this the other way around. Developers start at the aesthetic. We start with the emotional state that we're trying to create within the player here. Based on that emotional state, we say, okay, what are the cycling decisions that we want the player to be doing? And then based off of those decisions, what are the mechanics we need to cause those decisions? So this is sort of the first thing that junior developers have to do, is they have to sort of approach games from the opposite direction that they're used to doing it, after usually a lifetime of playing video games. So I'll actually just jump ahead here. So for example, I was helping out with another university a while ago that was doing a game jam where it was all about teaching math and physics. Like that was kind of the goal of the game jam here. So from that, we had to figure out some aesthetics that the developers could work with here. So we sort of decided that, okay, this had to be toy-like. The user had to be able to play with the product and then see the results here. And then the user had to just feel smart over the course of playing the game. Even though, sometimes when people do math and physics, they don't feel that smart. We had to make sure that the game made them feel that way. And we had to make the user feel rewarded for their efforts, even if, the reality of working in math and physics is sometimes you don't feel rewarded for your time, right? This was sort of their line in the sand, where they said, in playing with these games that get made over the course of this game jam, users are going to start feeling connected in this sense here. As during the talk, we talked a little bit about some games out there that have caused these feelings in other players. This is a game I played when I was younger here called Scorched Earth. And this was a game that did some of these things to me. Like it made mathematics feel like sort of a fun exercise that I could play with inside games here. So we spent a little bit of time trying to figure out these aesthetics, and then as developers start figuring out how to build games towards them. Okay, so why then do developers have aesthetic targets? And basically, this is because everybody on the team is too smart. Teams are assemblances of incredibly intelligent people who are all very capable of coming up with great ideas. And somehow we have to say, okay, how do we filter out the ideas which are good, but maybe don't fit the game that we're trying to build here? Okay, so in this example, we have this target emotional state, a game where the player feels like a little kid stealing cookies, and using this target emotional state, this target aesthetic, as a kind of net, we catch all the good ideas, perfectly good ideas that don't fit. Okay? And this is a huge problem in games here. If people want additional reading on this, I recommend you go to a website called lostgarden.com, which is run by a very clever designer called Dan Cook, who's done a bunch of GDC talks and whatnot. Really interesting designer, so I recommend that quite highly to people. Okay, so we have our aesthetic target, which is our target emotional state that we're trying to get the user to. This is a game where I kind of learned this principle. I learned it care of a very good designer called Eric Holmes that I used to work with. And they're making this Hulk game over at Radical. And this was the second Hulk game they were making. And this was the one that they really wanted to be, their magnum opus, like just the Hulk game to end all Hulk games. So they had a pair of incredibly good aesthetic targets. Back then they called them design pillars, but the result is the same here. And they had sort of these posters up in the team space that sort of said these aesthetics are the things that matter most, and every bit of work you do should be building towards these aesthetic targets. So those targets were Hulk smash and Hulk jump. So everything in the game basically had to be pushing towards Hulk smash and Hulk jump. And this is very useful, because then if people start suggesting things, which could be extremely good ideas, we could simply say, okay, very good idea, but does that, help the user reach these aesthetic targets of Hulk smash and Hulk jump? And if the answer is no, then we're simply not going to do those features. So very powerful tool, very useful tool of keeping teams focused in the face of extremely good ideas that just don't fit the project. Okay, I mentioned mechanics, so I think we'll cover that next. So mechanics, something that users for the most part get, developers for the most part understand. I press X and I do a little jump here. I pull the trigger and I shoot my weapon. I drive my car and I avoid the other cars on the road. Okay, like these are things that are reasonably simple for developers to get a handle on here. Now, a nice way to think about mechanics, though, when you're thinking about projects as a whole, is to think of them as sort of what's the predominant verb of doing inside the game. This is a concept I was first introduced to by Will Wright many years ago at one of his GDC lectures, where we look at a standard video game out there and we say, okay, what's the main verb the user is doing? And then we can kind of make sure the game sort of reinforces that verb. So, a franchise like The Sims, the main verb you do inside that game, especially the first game, was buying stuff. That's kind of how you most affected the world, was by kind of living within the catalog and spending your money and affecting the world as you play around with it. We've got lots of Mario games out there where obviously the primary verb is jump, right? Like that's the primary skill action that the user does, where they press the jump button now or later, and based on their skill of doing so, they succeed or fail. Then we've got lots of shooters out there where, of course, the primary verb for the most part is shoot. And then we get all these open world games out there, some of which I worked on, of course, where the primary verb is drive, right? Like most of what you do is explore this world. And students sometimes get confused on this one. They describe this as exploring, but explore isn't really the verb. Drive is the verb of this game. There's shooting and there's other things going on inside this game, but really it's driving that's at the heart of these franchises. And then it's fun to do a little experiment. And for this experiment, I went to a video game store kind of down the street from my office here, and I just took this photo. And then I divide the shelf into verbs. So for example, these are the games where you drive as sort of the primary verb. And then these are the games where you shoot. And these are the games where you fight. And these are the games where you jump. And then this is Dora Saves the Snow Princess, which is a game that I could not for the life of me figure out, right? Which sort of makes me sad because that's a good franchise. But then you repeat this experiment years later. You go to exactly the same shelf and you take exactly the same photo. And then you compare the verbs. And this is quite interesting because you can sort of see the ebbs and flows in the industry here. So, these are the games where you can drive. These are the games where you shoot. These are the games where you fight. These are the games where you jump. We've got Skylanders showing up over here. So this is a brand new verb that's been created in this case, namely the verb collect. Disney Infinity, the same sort of verb here. We've also got like a big thing of peripherals being sold on the same shelf, which is interesting. And then off to the side, we've also got various dance games, which I think are neat because dance games are sort of this new verb that gets added and kind of cyclically adds itself and removes itself from the industry. But isn't that kind of neat, though, that we add a verb and suddenly we just take over a whole new portion of the shelf for a while, which I think is pretty cool. And that basically means that there's not enough verbs in the game industry. And this is a lot of what the game industry is trying to do right now, is we're trying to discover and deploy new verbs. Because whenever we do so, we tend to find new success of different forms here. So, Katamari Damacy obviously is a different sort of verb entirely, but created this really cool franchise that is still going on, almost 20 years later. Or Minecraft, of course, with, sort of the verbs that it explored. Turning into a multi-billion-dollar indie success story, like just an absurd level of success that kind of had to come from an indie space, like probably was never going to come from a big company. Okay, so we were talking about mechanics, we talked about aesthetics, let's talk about dynamics a bit, because dynamics are the least understood thing here. This is this idea that there's cycling loops of decisions inside a game, and then the decisions are skill-gated with interesting choices and interesting failures here. Is a game that was worked on many years ago here. And this is that same sort of notion here, where I've got a user hiding from a bad guy. The bad guy looks for them. And if there's a countermeasure, they take it. And if there's not a countermeasure, they get caught. This is, pretty good. If I did this again today, I would probably add a little collectible here. So then the user is really tormented. And they would say, okay, do I hide down here or do I go for the collectible? And, if you talk with users, okay, what are you more likely to do? If you've done your job, you're probably going to get a 50-50 split, which is about right. It means this really is a tough decision for the user. And tough decisions are great decisions versus self-explaining decisions. Here's a really common shooter dynamic. Most shooters play like this in terms of cycling decisions. And then a fight starts. And then if I'm incredibly good at shooting people, I win straight away. But for most people, say 80% of people, 90% of people, you actually run out of ammo during the fight. And because you run out of ammo during the fight, we're going to get an interesting decision. Either throw a grenade, which is sort of a get out of jail free card, but I have a limited number, of course. Or I bash somebody in the face with a melee attack, which buys me some time. But of course, that means I'm still kind of trapped in this out of ammo state. Or I reload, which is a risky thing to do because I'm not engaging the enemies anymore. But reloading lets me re-engage, and then I can sort of work this loop again and again and again and again until I get outside the system finally. And if you play lots of shooters, you'll see these patterns over and over, sort of no matter what the game happens to be here. And I think that's really interesting that, just as a genre, we've kind of figured out what the interesting choices are likely to be. Now, we can still violate those choices. We can still play with the expectations. So something like reloading in Gears of War is actually a skill-based activity inside this dynamic, which I think is genuinely fantastic, like a really cool mechanic inside the game. RTSs, so real-time strategy games, are a cool franchise to play around in. But of course, they have a different dynamic, a very different dynamic, in that, I make a bunch of units, and if I make everything perfectly, I win the game. But most people don't do that, and they wind up out of resources, usually very, very quickly. And then they have to decide what they're going to do. They're going to say, all right, do I make more gathering units, which get me more resources? Do I make some army units that let me engage with the enemy? Or do I make more buildings, which lets me produce more of these assets here? And then we just sort of run this loop over and over and over again. RTSs are neat to explore, actually, as a designer, because there's often like this tipping point between sort of economy and combat, and that's sort of a subcomponent of this dynamic to play with as well. And here too, no matter what the game is, you see these sorts of patterns within the game. Then we get sort of funny genres that are kind of become deprecated over time. So for example, we have adventure games here, where you play an adventure game, I mean like kind of classic Sierra, King's Quest, Hero's Quest kind of stuff, and you just find a puzzle. And off the puzzle, I'm going to pixel hunt, which is to say I'm going to very slowly move my mouse cursor around or joystick cursor around, just looking for puzzle elements, like what's something that's part of the puzzle versus what's something static in the environment. And there's a whole thing we could do talking about, how we communicate what's part of puzzles to the users. Based off of that pixel hunting, we're going to kind of gather up everything inside the room, and then we're going to start combining them in different ways to try to figure out how I'm supposed to solve the puzzle. And hopefully, if you do your job, the user has some sort of epiphany. They suddenly understand the situation, and they suddenly feel brilliant. They reach this aesthetic target really, really easily here, even though it's exactly the same place that millions of other users have reached. If you do your job, they feel smart, and that lets them progress to the next area. They find the next puzzle. You see this lots in old adventure games and whatnot, but you also see it in newer games, things like The Room, which I recommend to everybody. Like The Room is a really interesting adventure game that manages to make just the mechanics of finding interactable objects quite a lot of fun within the game. Now, if you're trying to figure out like what the verb of your game actually is, a really good tip is just pretend your game's 10 seconds long. Like forget about your crazy story and forget about your hero's dark past and all the rest of that. Just pretend your game's 10 seconds long, and suddenly you have to become brutally honest about what the mechanics of the game are, and by extension, what the dynamics are. So, for example, I'm making a shooter, and I shoot, the enemy shoots, and I dodge, and that's the dynamic. Okay, and every component in there has to be interesting somehow. Or I spend some money, which lets me build some things, and lets me send units to attack. Or I pixel hunt, and then I collect, and then I combine. And somewhere within these loops is the skill gate, the thing that sort of stops the user unless they're at a certain skill level. And then we have to think about failure and what we do in those cases. So in games like Metal Slug, for example, shooting is not the main mechanic, but dodging certainly is, because you never stop shooting and you're always dodging. Or in kind of classic RTSs like StarCraft 2, for example, I would say that tipping point between economy and combat is where you'd send the units to attack. Like that's sort of the main skill inside the game. Or something like The Room, actually collecting items within the game is where the core skill is. So we have a thought about what does success look like, what does failure look like. And we try to sort of, just as developers, try to put all these things in order. So we're trying to recognize what our aesthetic target is, and then based off of that, we're trying to figure out what the mechanics and dynamics should be that let us reach that aesthetic target. Okay, great. So that's all like the basic foundational stuff. And then we're going to talk about using expectations. So expectations we can think of as being a budget that the game developers get to spend. It is a good thing to violate expectations sometimes. We have some sort of user expectation about what the, how the combat's going to play out, how the story is going to unfold, how to, use a particular puzzle element within the game here. And as soon as the user encounters any of these, they have the result that they expect, and then they have whatever the real result happens to be. And the trick here is that generally speaking, you give them the real result. Generally speaking, you give them the thing that they expect. But sometimes, 5% of the time, 10% of the time perhaps, you give them whatever the surprise is going to be. Sorry, I realize I said these backwards here. You get the likely result versus the real result. So sometimes we violate user expectations, but only sometimes. I'll give some examples of that. I like using sort of real world examples for this stuff versus video game examples. So I hope you feel the same. Here's a map of Vancouver. And if you were going to visit Vancouver, you'd probably get a map like this, because this is a pretty good map. It shows train lines, and it shows where one type of terrain turns into another type of terrain. You can see that here. I've got some forested areas here and here. Even though this is not important information, it's on the map. The scale is broadly speaking correct. If I'm over here, I know based on my distance from here to here, how far away this spot is over here. This is a pretty good map, but it's also a little bit of a boring map too. So then you say to yourself, okay, I like video games. So instead of using this map, I'm going to use a video game map when I visit Vancouver. I'm going to use this map. Now, this is a cool map, but this is maybe using expectations too much, right? We violated expectations too far here. Like, yes, it's cool to have a map that looks like a Mario world, but you can see that we no longer have kind of an accurate scale and position of where things are. We lost some train lines and bus lanes and whatnot. Like, if you use this map, you would definitely get lost. Like, just as, to take the metaphor a little too far, as developers, we've gone too far in terms of using and exploring expectations. Here's another example of this. And then I'm just going to show you a clock. And it's just a normal clock with an hour hand and a minute hand. And while you watch this, I want you to sort of ask yourself, what is the time? Okay, that's all. Just, and say the time out loud wherever you are as quickly as you can. Okay, we'll just do it like that. All right, so here we go. So what time is it? So 3, 2, 1, say it out loud. And I'll wager lots of you said 2:10, which is wrong. And then we hear a few more times, which is wrong. And then after a few tries at it, you'll say, oh, my mistake, it's 1:51, because these things are backwards. Now, by some standards, this is a bad clock, right? Because you look at it and you get the wrong time. But it's sort of interesting that because this is a bad clock and sort of consistently hard to understand, it actually turns into an interesting clock. And if you were going to buy a clock and you saw this clock next to other clocks, you'd probably be really intrigued by this one. You'd probably pick it up and explore it. You'd maybe buy it. Just a funny thought. So this is using expectations in what's maybe a good way. We've managed to make the clock interesting by violating user expectations of the clock. Inside game development, you see this all the time. So we've got a Mario game over here, and then we have the simply fantastic 2D game Braid over here. And for the most part, Braid is Mario, right? Like, for the most part, you move the same way, you go up and down ladders the same way, you jump on bad guys the same way. And that's incredibly useful as a developer here, right? So here we've got a jumping puzzle inside Braid where I've got this collectible here, and I have this bad guy who moves back and forth here, and then is respawned if I kill him. So the user looks at it and they say, oh, this is just like Mario. I know what to do. I'm going to jump on the person's head and come up and hit the little piece here. And as a result, okay, that's useful as a developer here. I don't need to tutorialize any of this. The user already knows what to do. But also, of course, there's no particular design impact, right? Like, nobody's going to buy the game if it's just a Mario clone at the end of the day. We're not violating expectations enough. Luckily for Braid, and this is why it's a great game and why Jonathan Blow is a great developer, they have this sort of rewind time mechanic where you could make crazy foolhardy jumps, and then if you miss, actually rewind time to come back to where you were before here. So programmatically, really interesting thing that they added to the game here. But of course, there's a cost that we have to pay. And that's sort of the message here when you're violating expectations, is that every time you violate expectations, it's useful for the game, but it creates a user experience cost that you have to pay. There's no way around that here. So this sort of experience has a huge impact on the game itself. This is basically what makes a game succeed or fail, is how I'm usefully violating these expectations. When you're working inside various genres, one of the first questions you can ask is, okay, what are the expectations of this genre? Sometimes these expectations are informed from other media. So for example, in shooters, most of a user's expectations inside a shooter are created from film. You know, we've seen lots of action films over the course of our life, and based off those action films, we come up with expectations of how the user is supposed to behave. Most users inside a shooter expect to basically be RoboCop. You know, they expect to perfectly shoot the bad guys every single time, like some sort of bad guy shooting machine. Okay, now that's ridiculous at best, but it is useful for developers because it lets us do things like aim assist systems and aiming friction and whatnot. It lets you do all this very video gamey stuff, which is definitely cheating, but the user never questions the fact that you're cheating. They just sort of happily watch themselves cheat and never question these things. These systems exist in PC games too, by the way, in case you think this is just a console-only kind of thing. Now, it's also quite interesting, though, of course, in that users expect themselves to be RoboCop and sort of perfectly shoot bad guys all the time. They expect the bad guys to be like these fellas and just like wildly shoot all over the place here. And then this lets us design encounters to the same effect here. So if I was designing a shooter today and that game had a sniper inside it, my snipers would miss their first shot. And the reason they would miss their first shot is because then that would let the user realize to themselves, oh, there's a sniper over there. And then they would turn and they would look and see the sniper. And then if they fail to do any of the actions they're supposed to do, like get out of the way or shoot the sniper themselves, then the user will say, oh, I failed and it's my fault I failed. Versus the more realistic thing, which would simply be the sniper shoots you in the head and that's the end. Some of this has its roots in cognitive science. It's actually quite a lot of fun to sort of study these things because just, you know, as users, we collect lots of data, you know, millions of examples of data just by living in the world and observing the world and watching films and video games and stuff like this. And then based off of this, we create metaphors, which are sort of collections of this data here. And then based off that, we create schema, which are the things that designers play with the most here. These are the expectations that I'm mostly talking about. And based off of schema, we create predictive models. And based off predictive models, we have sort of human behavior. Most of this stuff as designers, we don't think about here. We mostly just think about schema in the middle. And schema is sort of this, again, expectations notion of, does your product nicely fit into a category or is it unsortable? And if you're a student especially, you really, really want your stuff to be unsortable because unsortable stuff gets remembered. I work with a lot of students. I've seen literally hundreds of student projects at this point here. And it's very, very important to me that the games do not nicely fit into categories. They exist in and of themselves. And they don't, you know, people don't look at it and they say, oh, it's a puzzle platformer. I know that. They say, oh, it's a puzzle platformer where the user can sprout trees and then climb those trees to get to new areas and, you know, create problems that the developer has to unpack. This happens in non-gaming media too, of course. Like, for example, there's this genre of book, which is basically books that are sort of like Lord of the Rings. And if you're sort of like Lord of the Rings, you can find success. You can definitely find success. But it's hard to have a breakout success. You know, it's hard to have a success as big as Lord of the Rings. Okay. Then we get things that are kind of like Lord of the Rings, but don't nicely, they're different enough that they surprise people. So stuff like Song of Ice and Fire is a good example of that. You know, when somebody first told you about this franchise, you probably said to yourself, oh, that kind of sounds like Lord of the Rings. And then you find out that, okay, no, actually it's low fantasy where like the high fantasy slowly sneaks into the world over time. You know, it feels like a medieval combat to which we've subtly started to add elements of fantasy. And as a result, it feels like a real world encounters, even though we're talking about fantastical spaces. And of course, as a result, Song of Ice and Fire, hugely successful as Lord of the Rings for the most part. Here's some real world examples I really like when I talk about expectations. This is literally the door to the building where I work, okay? And I love this door because this is a fantastic example of expectations. Because people look at this door and they see this handle on the outside and they say to themselves, oh, a handle. I grab this handle and I pull it. That's how you open the door. And sure enough, people do that. They grab the handle and they pull it and it opens, and the world is wonderful and everything's great. Then people go to leave at the end of the day and they see this handle on the edge of the door, and they grab the handle and they pull it, and the door makes this beautiful sound. It's just this solid kabong bong sound where the door fails to open. And this is really interesting when you're a designer. This kind of door is called a Norman door, based off of some work done by a fellow called Dr. Donald Norman. And the reason this is important is because when you do this, and I'm sure you do this like probably several times a week, you blame yourself. You know, you don't blame the door. You don't blame the person who installed the door. You don't blame the architect that created the building. You say, oh, I'm so silly. Even though I know this door opens that way, I grab it and I pull it and I hear that sound over and over and over again, right? So this happens a lot where the user fails and then they blame themselves. They don't blame you. So you as a developer have to be really, really aware and really, really empathic about how they interact with systems. Here's the same sort of thing in the same building, actually. I've got this big light here inside a sound studio. Then I've got this track light right here, which runs from here to here. And you walk inside the room and then you look to your right and you see light switches. And your brain right away says, okay, which switch goes with which light? You know, I'm a smart person. I could probably figure this out. And most of you right now are probably saying, okay, this switch controls the big light. And this switch controls all these track lights here. And for the big light, you're correct. Congratulations, you figured it out. For the toggle that goes up and down, that controls this light and this light only, and that's it, right? So obviously that's a bad thing. That is a failure of design, right? We have not anticipated how the user is going to interact with these things. If we were seeking more self-explaining systems, what we would probably do is we would probably arrange these switches to be in the same shape as these lights. So perhaps I would have like an L-shaped series of toggles and then the one switch here in the same position, something like that. So at a glance, it can become self-explaining. If you're not trying to violate expectations, you want self-explaining systems as much as possible. Okay, this idea of violating expectations, you do it in writing all the time. If you're, especially in comedy writing, in fact, because you've got the start of whatever your story node is, or even your single sentence, right? And based off of that, we get whatever the user thinks is going to happen at the end of that sentence or that story node or that paragraph or, you know, that book in some cases. And sometimes you give them, you know, whatever the punchline is, okay? If you start a sentence, the user imagines the end of the sentence. And if you give them a different end of the sentence that still is logical with the start of the sentence, that is a joke. Like that's literally how you figure out what a joke is. These sorts of dual narratives exist simultaneously and then come together at the end. Now, I just want to do a time check here because I've already talked for almost 45 minutes. Should I keep going or should I switch into Q&A at this point? Because I have a lot of content to get through. If I don't hear anything, I'm just going to get going. Okay, silence means keep going. All right, here we go. So a while ago, I was designing a city for a video game. I mean, I say lots of people were designing a city for a video game. And so one of the challenges there is, of course, you can't make a real city. You have to make like an abstraction of a city. And we were, you know, quite young and trying to figure these things out here, right? And, you know, it's easy to sort of like do concepts and figure out sort of show locations or whatnot here, things that you definitely wanted to be inside the game itself. But, you know, we can't make a real city like, you know, Rockstar can, for example, right? And actually, even for Rockstar, it's a bit of a misnomer. So how can we make like a fake city that the user thinks is a real city? Sort of becomes the question here. How can we use user expectations to do this? Luckily, there's a bit of a textbook that we can use for this, which is to say Kevin Lynch, he wrote this great book back in 1957 called The Image of the City, where he just has people draw maps of cities just from memory. And I recommend people actually do that if you're interested in game design. Just draw a map of your city from memory and see what you draw. Because what people do is they over-exaggerate certain components of that city, right? Very consistently over-exaggerate certain components. And then it means that as developers, you only have to create those expectations. You don't have to make the real place. You have to make the expectations of that place. And that's much easier than trying to make the whole thing. Here is the city of Newark, New Jersey on the left here. You know, obviously, if you tried to make this, you would die of old age long before you ever built the city. And then here is a user's map of Newark. And if you created this with sort of excuses for the failures of content as you did so, it would be a better play space. And then the user would say, this is Newark, New Jersey, right? Even though you didn't create the whole place. Now, what Kevin Lynch noticed is that people over-exaggerate certain components within these cities. So for example, they over-exaggerate paths to a great degree, you know, kind of like ways of traveling throughout the city. They over-exaggerate nodes, which is where certain paths come together. They over-exaggerate edges, which is where one type of terrain turns into another type of terrain. And then they over-exaggerate districts, especially cultural districts. So, you know, I work in Chinatown, for example, right? And Chinatown has Chinese letters, Chinese calligraphy written around the area. And the color of this neighborhood is also different, right? That's sort of one of the primary ways you differentiate districts is via color. But people especially overemphasize landmarks. Above all else, they spend a lot of time describing landmarks, which is really interesting. Because in your day-to-day life, landmarks don't do very much, right? Now, theme parks know this incredibly well. Disneyland and Las Vegas and places like this, they know this incredibly well. So if you go to a place like Disneyland, you'll get a map, and the map is wrong. Like, it is wrong by design. And what's interesting is it's sort of more accurate at the start as you get reference points, and then gets less accurate as you go inside. Disneyland as a location is kind of a place made of landmarks. So you walk inside, and your brain sort of says, oh, this place is enormous. I will never see this entire place. I will never see all of it. This place is overwhelming me. Disneyland is the biggest place on earth. And after 3 days or so, you're like, oh, actually, it's kind of small, and I know where everything is. Right? I'll never forget that feeling the first time I went, where I was just like, I will be lost here forever. And then really quickly started figuring it out. Same with Las Vegas. Like Las Vegas, as you travel sort of the strip and you see all the crazy landmarks they have, you say, this place is enormous. I will never understand it. And then very quickly you understand it just fine. So this sort of suggests that the player of games, there's this funny belief that the number of landmarks is proportional to city size. If you've got lots of landmarks, you've got a big city. That's absolutely untrue, but it's interesting that this is sort of ingrained in people's mind, and you can take advantage of this. Some games figure this out really well, and they turn into gameplay. So LA Noire is a really interesting game that was made some years ago. And there's 50 landmarks within the city, and they sort of reinforce the user and encourage the user to find landmarks. So you drive around looking for landmarks, and because you're looking for landmarks, you're not noticing that for the most part, the city is static and artificial. That's incredibly useful to a developer, right? Because again, you don't have to make a real city. When we were making our city, we said, oh, we'll just look at a map from the TV show and we'll make that. And then we discovered that the maps from the TV show were terrible. They basically were not of any use at all. So then we looked at maps from other video games. Okay, a little bit better, but they didn't suit our genre here. And then we found, this was later in development, kind of too late for us, this map that was made by sort of some Simpsons fans, where they made this crazy map that was full of like every single show location here. And this is like that real map of Newark, New Jersey. Like if we tried to make this map, we would go bankrupt. There's no way we could make this map here. So we have to make the abstraction of this map somehow. So we sort of set some rules for ourselves. You know, here's where we're sneaking up on aesthetic targets. Okay, well, first thing we recognize is we're making a driving game, not a realistic world simulator. So everybody here who works in games has to say, resist the urge to be realistic, because that's a bit of a trap. Once you start trying to be realistic, you can sort of never stop. It also means you'll never finish anything. We have a very limited environmental budget compared to other open world games out there. Like honestly, a really small team compared to some of the big AAA companies out there here. And we also had really tight streaming loading constraints here, which gives us really tight constraints on our track designs that we could do. But what we did know is we knew what a good turn was. And this is that 10 seconds of gameplay I was talking about before. So here is a sort of just a screenshot here, and note this shape. Like this shape is a good turn within the game. This 90-degree turn is sort of when the game is at its most fun. You know, you do a power slide and you slide around the corner and you start driving again here. So remember, when you work in games, have a really good understanding of whatever your 10-second gameplay loop is. This is quite important. So what's the key player skill that's going to get repeated a million times over the course of playing it? In some ways, this game is just an excuse to do 90-degree turns all day. And lots of driving games actually follow a similar pattern here. So the game is just an excuse to do that skill again and again and again. This is a map of the world. And you'll probably note that this map is not a city, right? Like this map is just a loop. And the fact that it's a loop is quite interesting. And in fact, it's a loop with like false choices within it. So here the user can turn right or they can turn left. And based off of this, the user would say, okay, I'll turn left here and then I'll keep driving here. And I'll go all the way around the loop and wind up where I started. And then they say, oh, I guess because of my decisions, I wound up where I started. You know, the fact that it is a loop is sort of delayed in their mind for quite a long time because it still feels like a city here. There's also this sort of notion inside the game of we have zones which are full of landmarks, you know, show rich content here. So very expensive zones in terms of like trying to load these from moment to moment. They eat up a lot of memory inside the game. And then we have rails, and then rails are they don't have a lot of show content in them, and they give us an ability to load the next zone as you drive around here. So sort of our worst case scenario is sort of 2 zones and 1 rail, something like that. All right. And over top of this, we have to put like lots of shortcuts as well. And the shortcuts also have to follow these like loading principles here. And then they have this kind of level design idea of, okay, if the user follows the road, that's going to be longer, but it's going to be safer over time. And if they take a shortcut, that's going to be risk-filled and then shorter. We're going to give a lot of feedback. We're going to reward them for taking the risk as well. That's part of it too. Here's just a shot from the show, or from the video game rather. And this is inside a zone. And because it's inside a zone, you know, we give them a piece of show content to look at here. We give them the Simpsons house. And then they say, oh, the Simpsons house is here, and the neighbor's house is over here. And that means the whole landscape must be there. The whole neighborhood must be there, which is why we have kind of like fake things in behind here to suggest that the world is bigger than it is. Here's a rail. And you can see on the rail, we do kind of very simple geometry here. Again, these are show landmarks, but, you know, these are things that suggest the world is bigger than it is. But then we create excuses for why they can't get up there. You know, we have natural geometry here, things like the sea or cliff edges and stuff like this to try to constrain the user. If you go way up high in the air, you can actually see the whole world. And here you can definitely see that this is a fake place. And it's not even hard to see this if you're a user. But it's using the expectations of cities enough that the user doesn't question the fact that this is not a real place. Here's the same sort of thing. Like here we've got this like hard edge of the city here where one type of terrain turns into another type of terrain. And this is fantastic if you're a world builder because it means you don't have to do anything besides put a water plane down. But you know, the user forgives this absence. This is exactly why so many video games are on islands, or, you know, be there floating islands or islands inside islands in the sea or underground or things like this. They're convenient excuses for the constraints of the universe that the user lives within. We could also use city expectations to solve technical problems. So, for example, you're driving around and suddenly you see pop-up. You see a whole building suddenly appear. And that doesn't happen in the real world. We don't see buildings pop up. But we do see advertisement. So suddenly we start putting up advertisements in places where you know, we want to make sure the user just can't look around anymore. That's a useful thing for us. Now, here's some failures. I'll say it's literally one of my failures at this point, in that some environments you could go inside. And inside these environments, you would get, you know, contextual animations that would play and sort of props you could interact with, stuff like this. And that's all well and good. But this creates an expectation that now we have to work again. You know, this creates this expectation that, okay, I can go inside this building, which means I expect I can go inside any building, right? I see this all over the place in video games where the user can open one door. So then they start trying to open all the doors, okay? And then good video games have really clear visual language of like what can be opened and what can't be opened. Stuff like the Tomb Raider franchise I really like for this, of sort of literally painting marks that indicate where the user can go. Here's an example of that false expectation. So inside this interior, I've already gone through one door to get here. I have another door right here. And then the user tries to open that door and discovers that they can't. So we kind of put like little Band-Aid solutions on. You know, we put this doorbell here, a doorbell inside a school, right? But this doorbell that you could ring, and then you'd hear a line of dialogue from behind the door about why they couldn't open the door right now. So great, we had a little solution here that had people forgive our failures. But we also could have just not had a door, right? If this was just wall, this problem would have never been created for the user's point of view. Here you can see we had realistic fences because they look like the fences inside the show and they're the user's expectation of what to see. But then that means the user would try to like jump over these fences and they would hit an invisible wall and be disappointed, right? Like we would, by having a realistic fence, we actually damage the fiction of our artificial world. And that's a problem if you're a developer. I mentioned Tomb Raider previously. Tomb Raider does a much better job than I ever did. So Laura Croft here has just spent many hours climbing all over the world, you know, like she can go anywhere and do anything. And then suddenly she can't get through this chain link fence. So what they do is they provide a little excuse here. Okay, they say, all right, Laura can't get over this fence because there's this razor wire here. And then the user is kind of looking for these excuses. And they, typically speaking, accept this excuse and get on with their life. For Red Dead's a game I really enjoyed, like really deeply enjoyed. And you can see they've got kind of excuses on top of excuses here, which I really admire. You know, this is the edge of the world, but it doesn't look like the edge of the world, okay? Instead, we've got some water here that will literally kill the user if they go inside. And then on the other edge of that water that will kill you is some rocks you can't climb and some terrain, which is sort of like fearsome and horrible on the other side. And again, the user just says, oh, I can't go that way. Like the user creates their own excuse for why the world has a limit. And once you look for this sort of stuff, you see it all over the place. So here too, like we don't have like a gentle hillside. We have a harsh edge where the user will die if they fall off the other side. Or let's say we've got a really long loading time and we have to try to explain away this loading time somehow. Well, you put the user in a place where they're going to be stuck for a while, right? So, you know, the user suddenly is trapped within an elevator, or the user is inside a train slowly going from one place to another place. Okay, these are very common excuses for this sort of problem here. This is a funny solution where you start using fictional authority to explain your faults. So the user of this game has driven all over the place. They killed 100 people on the way here, and they've smashed their car into every car they see. And then suddenly they see this no cars beyond this point, and they can't get the car past there. There's an invisible wall. But the fact that there's this fictional authority here makes most users just turn around and drive away. And there's this funny thing I've discovered, which is that users obey fictional authorities more than they obey real authorities. It's quite neat. And as developers, you can take advantage of this. And when you notice that users are starting to tire of traveling within your world, those are the moments where you suddenly add rapid transit systems. You sort of say, okay, this mechanic now needs to be kind of retired. And we're going to let people short circuit this mechanic for a time. As developers, we look for setting up false expectations. Here's a false expectation, which gets called false promise a lot, where this user is playing this little 2D game here, and they have to jump down here. Like just in the level design says they now have to jump. But users hate doing this because the expectation inside a 2D game is that jumping off screen kills you. So if I have to do this sort of stuff, I have to then, you know, kind of breadcrumb people from one side to the other side. I'll give a quick example here from a mobile game. So this mobile games have very different design problems from, say, console games and PC games. Like people interact with mobile games differently here. And then as designers, you're supposed to anticipate what the user is going to do from moment to moment. Luis, did you have a question or a comment you had to do? I see you've jumped in. I see a camera's been turned on. Nope. All right, well, I'm carrying on then. So if we think about that Norman door problem at VFS, like remember that the user blames themselves. They don't blame you, the developer here. So the failures often get unreported. So what they can do, and can they do it, becomes a key question here. And tutorials should always be seen as a failure. right? If you have to do tutorial is your last resort. You have failed as a designer to make a game discoverable. So based off of that, what can you do? We're after self-explaining systems. If you don't know what I mean by self-explaining systems, I mean stuff like a screwdriver. If you're using a screwdriver in the wrong screw, you are doing the wrong thing. There is really no question of that. You blame yourself. You don't blame the carpenter. You don't blame the architect here. So if I'm playing some sort of game, I want to use natural mapping as much as possible. If I'm shooting a gun, I want to pull the trigger because that simply feels correct to the user for the most part here. For the most part, it's self-explaining or discoverable. And here's a good opportunity to violate expectations sometimes. So, reloading in this game I thought was fantastic because suddenly they have this golf swing mechanic. And if you reload well and skillfully, your bullets do more damage for a while. I love that because it doesn't make any sense at all. Like bullets don't move faster because you loaded your clip well. But, users, generally speaking, really appreciated this violation, right? Because it took something which was quite boring and it made it interesting. But if every single mechanic in the game did this, then that's overdoing a violation. And that's not interesting anymore. If you overdo violations, it means the user is going to stop trusting you. And that's quite a bad thing. Here's a mobile game I got to play and goof around with a bit here. And I did some completely blind play tests with students, which I thought was quite interesting, where I just got them to play and I watched them play. And I got them to sort of like vocalize what was going on inside their mind while they played. What many developers do, and I really feel this is a mistake, is people play the games and then the developer asks them questions or gives them questionnaires. I don't think those are very valuable at all. I think you have to sort of get that surface level thinking here to understand what's going on. And in this completely blind playtest, we discovered that users understood the main mechanic very quickly, that it was self-explaining, right? Then we discovered that users would build this expectation of sort of how to attack, and that expectation gets fulfilled in the game. So far, so good here. And most importantly, on mobile, it meant that the controls were discoverable on mobile without a tutorial, which is great. There's some sort of special built scenarios in the game that made it easier for people to figure out the controls. But for the most part, it's not really a tutorial. But a lot of stuff that seemed obvious wasn't obvious to new players here. There's sort of this idea within the game that bumping this guy into the bad guy would do damage. So bumping into your own teammate would also be a bad thing and also do damage. And that's actually the opposite of what the game design was trying to do. And that's obviously a huge problem to overcome here. So then they had to like shift the design here to increasing feedback on their bumps. It's a really good thing to do, and I recommend anybody who works in games do this, which is get people to do a blind playtest and then you watch the playtests. It's always worth reminding yourself that focus testers are not there to have fun. Focus testers are there to sort of fail, and then you as a developer can sort of observe how they're failing and see how you can reinforce the discoverability of the mechanics of the game. You find subtle failures, which I think is quite neat. Let's say the game was here on my phone. People would tap things that they thought were buttons. Now, of course, the analytics of the game would not report that tap, right? It would sort of be a ghost tap within the game here. But they'd be clicking this. Maybe they were hoping they could buy a rank or find a way to increase the rank of their character or get some information about ranking up, right? This is an opportunity for the developers to take advantage of. But without sort of really observing how users interact with the game, I think you would miss that opportunity, and that's a real shame. I have seen some developers say things like they're playing the game wrong. Remember, the user is not playing the game wrong. The user is playing the game exactly the way they think is correct. And then you as a developer have to sort of co-opt that expectation into the sort of aesthetic target that you're trying to reach. Mobile game rewards are a tricky thing because users have expectations here too you have to deal with. Users expect to be rewarded for all their effort, whether they succeeded or they failed. And obviously that's unrealistic, but they have that expectation. Users are expected to be rewarded for their skill, even if they aren't particularly good at the game. And users expect to be lucky sometimes, but you can't always be lucky. Luckily here, users do expect like an ebb and flow in their luck, which often gets called by gamblers the tides of luck. This idea that, oh, I'm on a lucky streak now, and now I'm in an unlucky streak. So great, as a developer, you want to take advantage of this. And you want to have like a long-term tide of luck and then a short-term tide of luck. and then sort of a combined term where these things stack on top of each other and lead to, funny peaks and troughs, rather than just a consistent schedule of lucky moment, unlucky, lucky moment, unlucky. Some games fulfill expectations almost perfectly, right? So Clicker Heroes, which is just a simple clicker game I really like, rewards expectations. Like a click gets you 1 click worth of output over and over and over again. A game like Super Hexagon, your skill of the game turns into rewards of the game every time. Various poker games online or whatnot here, they reward, like the user expects to be lucky sometimes, and they expect to be unlucky at other times. Very much fulfill expectations. Then you get violations of expectations. A really low amount of effort in an online poker game can turn into a big payout, and indeed more commonly than it would in the real world. Okay, this is useful violations. Or big franchises like World of Warcraft, the way that they sort of like lower content down to users over time means that even lower skilled players will eventually get really, really cool stuff. And then same with like lots of mobile games. Lots of mobile games out there will let you violate luck sometimes, right? And you can guarantee a lucky moment, either by buying a lucky moment or having actions in the game that cause these lucky moments. Here's probably my favorite example of violating expectations of all times, which is this old game called Eternal Darkness. Really interesting game made by a Canadian company like 20 years ago or so. And inside this game, they sort of had this insanity meter that would fill up based off of what happens within the game. The idea being is that you would let this like lower as much as possible and you'd finish the game as sane as possible. But they noticed that users would become insane as quickly as possible here because they like being insane more. And then they were smart enough to reinforce this, which I thought was great. This kind of is what polish is, right? Recognizing user emergence and reinforcing it. So inside this game, if you play it and your sanity is too low, you become too insane. First of all, they start skewing the camera a bit, which is a violation of expectations inside a game. One of the main expectations of a game is that you don't mess with the camera. Here, it's hard to see here, but the user's head is actually exploded in this scene because they do playing the game and then suddenly they turn into a zombie and their head explodes. And then they would bookend this with flashes of white before and after. And then the character would usually say something when they came back to sort of the real world. And they would say, "What is going on?" So they would make it really clear, we just violated your expectations right now for fun, but now we're back to normal. And that's very important, right? That if you're going to violate expectations, you make it clear what just happened. The game would sometimes pretend to delete your save games, which is a wonderful violation. Like no user thinks like, oh my God, the game is pretending to delete my save games. So everybody would fall for this, right? And at first they'd be terrified and then they'd laugh and then they'd love it. Sometimes the game would throw up pretend blue screens, like the game itself had failed, and then flash white and come back again. So that's like a violation of expectation right down to the hardware itself, which is cool. I'll give you one example of a violation which got me, like 110% got me. I'm playing the game, I'm having a good time, and suddenly the volume for the game like dips down to nothing, and it says mute on the bottom corner of my TV. So I say, oh, I sat on my remote. So I start feeling around trying to find my remote. And then the game flashes white and my sound comes back. And I realize that I haven't owned a TV that says mute since like 1995, right? So they're using my expectations of what TVs do to sort of build this feeling that I'm insane within the game. Really cool stuff, right? This is reasonably cheap, these sort of violations of expectations too, which is why I encourage developers to do this sort of stuff here. Here's a little Steam game I found which does this. So you're playing this game. It says, choose a name for your game. Choose wisely, as it can't be changed later. So the user writes changed later. Okay, to which the game says, haha, very funny. Like they anticipate the fact that lots of people, when they read this text, will actually write exactly that. Then it can't be changed later. Please type another name. So you type another name. And the game says, I'm getting sick of you. So then it says, choose a name for your game. Choose wisely, as it can't be changed later. So you type the name wisely, and the game ends and disappears, which I think is great. Like it actually, like it pretends it's sick of you. Really, you're just doing exactly what the developers kind of hoped you would do. Very cheap, but delightful. Okay, so if you're working on a video game or a film or a book or anything really, right? We want to gain attention for the product. And we want to surprise the user. So we're going to violate expectations sometimes. Standard systems, which is to say things like controls and whatnot, should usually be left standard, and then don't tutorialize those systems. And that's sometimes very challenging. Like sometimes people, their first reaction is to immediately tutorialize a system. You as a developer, you've got sort of a budget for violations, whether you're designing something or writing something or building something or using technology or what have you here. And overusing those violations means the user or the reader or the viewer will stop trusting you. And losing trust is basically like the death of your product. But you do have to violate expectations sometimes if you want to have any reasonable success at all. And this is, I would say, extra true for students, because students are trying to stand out a little bit in a world where there's lots of highly similar students and lots of other people trying to break into whatever technical or creative industry they're trying to break into. And that's the end of my talk. So I'm Christopher Mitchell. I've got my email up there if people have questions, cmitchell@vfs.com. And then I've got my Twitter up there if people want to follow there. Luckily, I can keep going if there's questions. Don't actually know how many people are watching the talk.
Oh, man. Oh, boy. Yeah. Hey, Christopher.
Hey.
Oh, man. Thanks a lot. It was amazing. It was, man, you went so much further than I thought you were going to go. And I already talking with Marcus so he can put on our curriculum this talk, because it was a great summary of game design problems and questions that we have all the time. And I'm usually the guy they come to get these questions and do the Q&A, because I'm a tad better with English than the other teachers.
Sure, okay.
And I always use my power for evil, because I'm also one of the teachers working on game design and a game designer myself. And I get the first question for myself.
All right, that's perfectly fair.
Yeah. And in this case is actually a bit personal for me, because Death Spank was one of my favorite games.
Hey, cool, man. Yeah.
Around 2010, I bought my PS3. And I had a personal thing, because this was way before I was working with games. I was a comic artist.
Oh, cool.
And I used to write web comics, and I love comedy. And I grew up as a PC player with adventure games like Monkey Island, Grim Fandango, Full Throttle on this fix. And by the 2010s, I had a feeling as a player that funny games were disappearing.
That is somewhat true, unfortunately.
Yeah, they were. I don't think that anymore. I thought actually been seeing really good examples like Untitled Goose Game, that I think is a very, very, very funny game. But comedy in games is a very hard thing to do. Comedy is a very hard thing to do. I believe is one of the hardest feelings to make another person feel. It's easy to make someone cry. It's very hard to make them cry of laughter. And when I played Death Spank, I thought to myself, "Whoa, this game is funny." And I wasn't expecting this from a game that wasn't an adventure. Years later, I mean, a few years back, 5 years back, I was writing on a game, and it's a visual novel. And it was I tried to write comedy for this visual novel, and I got in a lot of walls, not from writing, but from thinking game design from a comedy perspective, because comedy is not a mechanic, but it can be. I believe it. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that as a game designer and a writer.
Like comedy is a challenging thing to work in. I suspect because like people often don't understand how difficult it is to do, especially game developers, right? Like lots of game developers say, okay, like we'll just have the designers do the writing for it or whatever, right? And like they don't really take the challenge of writing it that seriously. Coupled with the fact that users of the games then immensely care about comedy to an overwhelming extent. And if you have something in there that you want to be funny, but they don't think is funny, the reaction is like it's kind of insane, the reactions you get from people. Like if you want something to be scary and it's not that scary, users will barely say anything. Like it's sort of a non-event. But if you have something in there that you want to be funny and it's not funny, the user sort of reacts like, well, why would you do that? Like, why don't you just put in more funny stuff? Stop doing unfunny stuff and do more funny stuff, right? Which I think hugely misses the point of how difficult it is to do.
Yeah.
Right? I would say, just as a writer, like writing comedy is a lot more mechanical than than people expect, right? And oftentimes when I do comedy writing, I still sometimes do comedy writing with friends. I really like to have that notion of, okay, if I start a sentence or I start a funny scene or something like this, I have to violate whatever the start of that sentence suggests if I want this to be a funny scene at all. You know, like that's what setups and punchlines are, right? So I'm working with a few people right now on some funny things, just, you know, among friends. And sometimes like jokes just take too long to happen, right? And that's the biggest bit of feedback I'll give most of the time, is I'll just say, like, look, your premise is great, but you've got 2 whole minutes here of just continuing the premise. Like, how about just say a sentence, let the user's old mind fill in all the backgrounds here, and then just cut straight to wherever that violation of expectation is supposed to go, right? Like let's say I'm telling a joke about Brazil, for example, right? Something like this, right? So the second I say the word Brazil, the user is going to have like whatever their expectations of what Brazil is supposed to be. And I have to immediately violate that expectation and start talking about something entirely different if I seriously want that to be a joke, right? And like, I don't know what that would be, right? Like that's where you sit down and you do your workshopping and try to figure it all out, right? But it's the biggest thing I've noticed with people trying to do comedy is they just take too long, right? There's a Canadian comic who called Norm Macdonald. Who like Norm,
maybe the best.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And he used to say that like the best jokes where is the setup and the punchline are all in the one sentence.
Yeah.
You know, and some of his best jokes, indeed, the one that you most remember, are literally like just one sentence that don't even really have like a punchline in them, you know, but the whole thing is self-contained.
Sometimes they even take some time so you can understand correctly. You do go.
That's right.
It comes from down up. I love Norm, man.
Yeah, and video games, I think, suffer for this somewhat. Like, you know, I've done a lot of comedy video games, in that kind of the trappings of being inside a video game just take a long time. You know, in terms of like he says something, he's, you know, like we do these conversations like bounce back and forth, which in a film would be like a 2-shot or something like that, right? But inside a video game, it's just kind of like more laborious. And as a result, it's just kind of harder to do compared to, you know, like let's take God of War. Like God of War, brilliant game, really, really good. But trying to imagine it like as a comedy is sensationally hard, because all the things that made it work as like an action title and sort of like an epic storyline kind of fall apart as a comedy.
Yeah, and I just find this like very interesting because video games are infant media.
Yeah.
Right. Most of us that are over 30 grew up with the media, and even though fear and excitement can be so truly transported to us during a playthrough, comedy is not that easy. And I look at this not as a challenge, but as an opportunity, maybe. I mean, there's a whole field of things that can happen in games that are not happening. And maybe we need people to start making this. And when and on the flip side, do you think that being a comedy writer, or not a comedy writer, but having wrote comedies and funny stuff, that helped you on game designing, especially because your brain's already wired into breaking expectations?
Yeah, well, one of the best things you can do as a game developer is find a design solution for a technical or artistic problem, right?
Yeah.
And if you can, I used to do this all the time, right? Where we'd be like, okay, the user is occluded by this wall, so we have to make some sort of shader that like shows the user through the wall. You know, like we create this whole kind of technical problem here or whatever. And then I, as the designer, hopefully just says, well, look, let's just break the wall, and then like you can see the user just fine, and we don't have to make this fancy shader and cause all these technical headaches for ourselves. Good developers do that all the time, right? Like they can find sort of design solutions for technical problems. If your design solution is then like actually kind of delightful or funny in some capacity, then like that's it. Like you're hired, like you're a rock star in the industry here. And if it can't be funny, at least it should be contextualized within the universe. Like it should be logical that this unusual solution, this expectation violating solution exists within the world. So let's say, for example, we're working on a Lord of the Rings video game, right? And then the person's playing as Frodo and they go behind a wall. And you could then see Frodo on the other side of the wall, but he's in that sort of like ghostly, I'm wearing the ring now look. Okay, great. Like that's consistent with the fiction of the universe. And as a result, the user will never say, oh, well, it's funny, I can see Frodo now. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a lot of what a developer has to do. There's like the brute force solution to everything, which is just like try to build and spend your way out of problems, but that's not how you finish video games, right? Like kind of artful design is better. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, man. Let's go to the student questions. Yeah, otherwise, cool. I'm going to be talking to you all night long.
All right.
Wall, I don't know his name. He's just Wall, okay, sure. His username. He asked, at what point it becomes not interesting anymore to explain or not explain to a player if an action is or isn't possible?
Okay. So that's a really good question, because that's sort of that test of like, is something discoverable by the user? And if it's not discoverable, what can you do to make it discoverable? Luckily, it's getting a bit easier in the industry because, we're getting more used to conventions of things. So let's say like this pen is supposed to be discoverable. It's supposed to be usable by the user. So when I look at it, I put a glow around the outside of the pen or something like this. I can make stuff fit.
Like explosive red barrel. Barrel or explode.
Yeah. Red barrel is a great example, right? Now, hopefully there too, like that glow somehow makes sense within the context of the world. Like that's where I like to think about, say like the Batman games. Like, like the Batman games will show you everything you can interact with when you use your little bat vision. They could show it all the time, right? But they choose not to because it's more contextual to the fiction of the universe that they're trying to make, which I like a lot. Now, if you're consistently failing and you're running out of time, sometimes as a developer, you just have to do a tutorial, right? And that's okay, right? Like it's not the end of the world here. But I do think it's worth approaching certain genres with caution. So puzzles are the best example. Like if you're a puzzle designer, your first question has to be, what do I do if they fail to solve the puzzle? Because most of the time, users fail to solve the puzzle. So how do you solve these things? So DeskBank was a great example, like because DeskBank, we had that fortune cookie hint system, and I sort of like I like that the fortune that was Ron's idea. The fortune cookies are brilliant because like just this notion of like, okay, I break open this magic fortune cookie and get a hint for the puzzle, and then it's a limited resource that I as a designer can spend. It's a great idea, really, really great idea. And then we have sort of like a really simple philosophy to those cookies. So the first one would be an incredibly vague hint, like maybe the user would get some sort of hint from it. And the second one would be like a little bit more of a hint, maybe, okay, it's definitely a black item you have to use in the room. And then the third one would just be like, just use the red paint, like the third. But even then, like in the fiction of the comedy we're making, that's okay, right?
Yeah.
So I like that solution a lot where, okay, we're doing a puzzle game. Puzzles mean failures. Failures means hints. And then we find a funny system for the hints. Like I think from top to bottom, like that's a really good system.
I remember breaking fortune cookies just to see the answers. I even knew the puzzle already. I just want to read them.
Yeah, it's and you get similar stuff with like audio diaries are a good example.
Yeah.
Like I think audio diaries in games are actually now quite overdone, and now people are like doing them just to like hear the contents of the diaries. But like in the sense of like collect everything so they can get the achievement. But I do think there's a lot more people could do of a similar vein, suggest stuff. Like I love it when you go inside a person's room in an adventure game and there's books on a bookshelf, and you look at the book titles make sense, or maybe they suggest something weird or funny about the person whose room you're in. Like I love that stuff inside games.
Yeah. It's still on the tutorial thing. Paulo asked, what's your personal process of making things obvious enough for not having to make a tutorial?
Okay, so personal process is this. We make whatever the game is with absolutely no tutorials at all. Then we get people to, there's two things you can do. The one is you just show people the game. They don't play it. You show people the game and you show them the controller. And you say, okay, you tell me what buttons you push to control this game and what you think you can do. And then you write all that stuff down. And that's really interesting information because you're like, oh, everybody's saying that like A is probably a jump button, but we don't even have jumping in our game. You know, like, is that a problem? Like, okay, and we can say, okay, we have to reinforce this. We have to not do this. The other thing to do, of course, is then to get people to just play the game completely blind and see what they're doing over the course of the game here and see what things they're failing to do. Lots of games made by students often have too many mechanics in them. Like they'll have 10 mechanics and 2 enemies, right? And then they do a blind test of the game, hopefully early on in production. And they discover that users can beat the game by never pressing the Y, never using this particular mechanic, never using this mechanic, that kind of stuff. And the smart thing to do there is actually to cut those mechanics. Like you don't need them, right? And then take all the effort you were going to put into reinforcing those mechanics into other things in the game. I now have twice as many particle effects for my other things going on inside the game. So 2 basic techniques there. The first being, just show them the game and note down what they think it is before they even interacted with it. And then the other one is, hopefully done with different people, get them to play the game and note everything they're trying to do, hopefully with some sort of good analytics out there. Like these days inside Unity and Unreal, there's no reason why you can't track every single button press the user does. And you can say, wow, the user pressed like the X button 45 times, even though they only need to press it 3 times. So should we change combat so they do more damage if they spam X? Like, do we encourage this behavior? Probably, right? It's not a given, but probably is the answer there. Yeah. And then at the end of the day, okay, we say, all right, they never discovered how to block, but blocking is critical. So we're going to have a bad guy that blocks attacks. We try to suggest things within the world that suggest these things that we're trying to do. And then if we fail on that one too, okay, we're probably adding a tutorial, but that's okay. Yeah.
Maybe he finds a shield on the floor. And, whoa, that's a shield.
That's right.
He can block attacks.
Yeah. There was, I think it was Metroid 2, maybe. I forget which one. But there's a part where you're trapped inside a pipe. And the way to get out of the pipe is to wall jump out of the pipe, right? But there's no tutorial that says how to wall jump. But above you are bad guys wall jumping up the pipe, right? And I think anybody who looks at that sort of says, oh, I bet I can wall jump too.
Yeah.
Right. And sure enough, the user wall jumps out, and that's that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And we have one more from Pedro. He asks about game difficulty. Like, he used Elden Ring and Souls game as an example of games that become famous as being hard games and frustrating games. And how do you balance this in that? How do you not make game so frustrating that is unplayable?
Yeah, I mean, the boring answer is focus testing with blind players, people that have never experienced it before and sort of seeing how they deal with it. You always have to recognize that you as the developer, you are like the top end or near to the top end of players that will ever encounter it. So you can never tune a game for yourself. This is a really common thing with junior developers or some of even senior developers, where a game just sort of like accidentally becomes much too difficult. And I think actually kind of damages its possibilities of its success as a result. There's a really good talk online you can find about this by Richard Garfield. I think if you just look up like Richard Garfield and difficulty, you'll find like a 45-minute talk he did on sort of balance. Oh, it's balancing. If you look up Richard Garfield and balancing.
Oh, great.
You'll find a really, really good talk on sort of balancing video games that I recommend to anybody who's into game development, like really cool stuff. And just sort of the way that over the course of development, sort of what you're tuning and who you're tuning for sort of can't help but change, right? And then sort of like the different categories that players can fall into and things like that. So yeah, that's 45 minutes very well spent for people interested. Yeah.
All right, great. Let's see if you have any more. Just one quick and easy last question from Lucas. How far do you go to, make the players feel good without compromising your game view?
Oh, okay.
That's the old hard question, right?
That's a great question, right? And I'm actually of the opinion that, okay, while you have your aesthetic target, like the emotional state you're trying to go for, Some developers do have an incredibly strong feeling of like, this is the design vision and this is exactly where they're going, right? And I actually am a proponent of more or less the opposite. Like, I think developing games is a discoverable art form. You know, like you are, whether you know it or otherwise, over the course of production, you will make discoveries and you have to reinforce those discoveries. And that's more important than whatever your design vision was. Okay. You know, we're not Citizen Kane, like we're the cameramen filming Citizen Kane, you know, like we have to point in the right direction. This gets complicated though, because over the course of production, sort of our ability to act on design insights collapses very quickly over time, right? So like at the start of a production, we have a really strong capability to like pivot and reinforce things. And then after a time, that sort of like eats away until at the end, we can only make like really minor adjustments to the game. And that's quite challenging. So generally speaking, I don't think developers should be doing like heavily architected developments. Like, I don't think a heavily architected development will turn into a good experience in most occasions, right? Maybe in some like whatever 6-year, 8-year crazy expensive development, right? But those are so high risk. Like, I don't even know why a developer would do that versus slow burn discoverable developments. Coffee Stain Publishing is a publisher I really like, that a lot of the games they've published tend to be like small teams, slow burns, where there's kind of a place they're going and there's goals, but they're definitely reinforcing the successes of those projects. Okay, they're the publisher of games like Valheim and Satisfactory and stuff like that.
Oh,
like, games I really enjoy. But that's not a heavily architected experience. You know, there's certain things they're reaching for, but for the most part, you can sort of tell the way the developers are being healthily flexible. I like that a lot.
I really like thinking of player feedback as an opportunity of sorts. In my game, we used to have a dog in the scenery.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of feedback of people saying, "Can you pet the dog? Why you can't pet the dog?" You know. So we made an update. That you could pet the dog, but you died.
Oh yeah, funny. Yeah.
So that was my way of breaking expectations. We have fun. They have fun. We said what they wanted. We did what they wanted us to do, but in our way. So I think it's always, everything's an opportunity.
It is
some sort of way.
And sometimes as a developer, so this is more like what a producer would say in that same situation. Yeah. Where you're like, okay, so people want to pet the dog, and I want to ship on time. So let's delete the dog.
Yeah.
Right? And the problem disappears, right? And the user never knows what you cut, right? Like, they never say this would be a great game unless I added a dog. So, you know, that it is an option. It's something available to developers to think about, right? Like, sometimes design problems can go away just by like deleting the design problem, right? But, you know, like, also you do the best you can, and sometimes you say, you know what, like, we want people to pet the dog, we're gonna let them pet the dog, and we're gonna kill them when we do it. So fine, yeah.
All right. Yeah. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's take one more.
All right. Burning Potato just asked about from Level Up from Scott Rogers.
Yeah.
He talks about the theory of unfun, where you start with a fun idea, and during development you remove what's not fun. All right. Yeah. And he asks, he don't know if you agree or don't agree with this theory, but at what point is viable to remove unfun ideas that could also be innovating or maybe just agreeable with your game? They're not fun, but they are interesting or different.
Yeah. Okay. The connection was a little suspect there, so I missed part of that, but I think I get the gist of it, right?
All right.
Because Theory of Fun is a well-known book and whatnot.
Yeah.
Okay, so that broadly fits into like a normal production methodology, right? The sort of stuff we were talking about before. This idea that I have a high capacity to, you know, manipulate my game at the start, and then a really small capacity to change it at the end, right? And you know, we find the fun stuff and we reinforce those things, and then we say, okay, what's honestly not working? And the things that honestly aren't working, we're just going to cut. And it's so hard to get people to cut stuff. This is where aesthetic targets come in, because aesthetic targets sort of say, like, look, at the end of the day, this feature doesn't work, so we're just going to cut it and walk away from it. And it's super, super hard to do. You sort of get this too with cases where, like, okay, somebody says, okay, this happened in DeskBank actually. Somebody said like, all right, let's add a jump button. And the next question was, okay, if we add a jump button, we have to add things to jump over or on, and suddenly we like create this whole branch of problems that didn't even need to exist. So, and that's kind of that unfun notion, right? Of saying, okay, should we just cut this whole concept and get on with our lives, right? Because we're busy people and we don't need to add that. In that specific example, yeah, we just cut that whole conversation off and never even explored it. And like the game didn't suffer for it, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely do agree, but in the sense that early in projects, it's still possible to. And I almost don't mind the idea of even in team spaces, like having this as a physical thing in a team space somewhere that says like, yeah, in the first third of the project, we're going to fiddle with this a lot. At the end of the project, we're not going to fiddle with this very much at all. There's a website I recommend to people called lostgarden.com, which is a really good website done by Dan Cook. And he talks about this sort of notion quite a lot in there, the idea of like declining ability to act on design insights. And cutting content because you don't find it fun is an expression of that, right? You sort of say like, I've got this great idea to make it work. And this clever people on the team say, we could also cut it and we're finished today, and then we can polish the stuff that we're committed to finishing. Really tough to do, incredibly tough to do, but like good developers do it all the time. Yeah, actually, franchises like FIFA and whatnot are a good expression of this, because when they work on FIFA, the team kind of they work on things and they try to polish the game and they try to introduce enough features to make the next release of FIFA really interesting, and then they hit whatever the critical date is, and at the critical date, anything that's still in progress just goes to the next FIFA. They're just like, that's it, we're done. This is a machine, and no, we're not going to stop the machine because you want to have whatever customizable balls. Right? So,
yeah. All right. Thanks again, Christopher. This was amazing. DevSpank was the first game I 100%ed on PS3. Yeah. So let's get Diane. Great. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I will talk in English first so I can thank Christopher once again for joining us. PUC Minas has always brought us amazing students, and we are very excited to be here today and also to let you guys aware of our scholarship campaign that's going on. So I will thank Christopher once again for your time. We have talked about 30 to 40 minutes, but since Christopher is amazing and PUC is amazing, we are 1 hour and a half with this talk. So it was pretty good, pretty awesome. And while we were talking about it, I was just thinking about the games that I've played. And I was like, oh, that's right. Oh, Mario is just like that. You know what? So like League of Legends and stuff like that. So it was really cool for me as well. I always love talking about this. So thank you so much, Cris, for joining us. I'm going to speak in Portuguese now, which is a bit better for all the students. Obrigada, professor Marcos, novamente. Obrigada a todo mundo que participou. Obrigada ao Daniel e o Pedro, Paulo.
Paulo.
Professor Lipão, pela
e o
presença.
professor Lipão.
Exato. Muito obrigada. Eu quero só falar rapidinho, não vou tomar muito do tempo de vocês, porque a estrela é o Christopher, não sou eu. Eu sou uma mera participante aqui. Falar sobre a nossa campanha do edital de bolsas que está acontecendo. Nós fazemos algumas campanhas durante o ano, e esse ano a gente trouxe novamente a nossa Latin America Talent Scholarship. Eu vou dividir com vocês no chat mesmo. E eu acho que eu não posso dividir no chat. Oh my God.
Pode cola nesse chat privado que eu coloco lá no YouTube para eles.
Porque eu tô com os dois abertos, né? Eu tô com um olho no peixe e outro no gato. É assim que a gente faz. E esse edital, nós temos o curso de Game Design, 3D, VR, AR, Sound Design. Também colocamos cursos de Digital Design, de Sound e de Programming disponíveis. Vai ser um edital que vai acontecer até o dia 14 de abril, perdão, até o dia 15 de abril, então os alunos têm até essa data para fazer a aplicação. Os meus contatos estão nessa landing page que vocês vão ter acesso, então se surgir qualquer dúvida referente ao edital em si, é só entrar em contato. Os ganhadores serão divulgados em maio, provavelmente na primeira semana de maio, eu estou falando aí do dia 2 de maio, e eu espero ver ganhadores da PUC, inclusive, tá? A gente já teve alguns ganhadores no passado também, né? Alguns dos nossos top students são da PUC Minas, então eu sempre fico muito contente e ansiosa de ver o trabalho de vocês. Então, por favor, apliquem, quero ver tudo que vocês estão fazendo e vai ser um prazer poder ajudá-los em todo o processo.
Daiane, eles já receberam o flyer, receberam o link, né? Receberam um vídeo nosso falando exatamente isso, né? Que inclusive até a Helena entrou agora ali no chat, eu estava vendo que ela chegou. A gente tem a Gabi, né? Que também já ganhou. Então, assim, a gente quer continuar essa ponte aí com a Vancouver Film School, mandar os alunos para o Canadá. Então, assim, a gente só tem a agradecer, assim, demais. Eu estava aqui, o professor Lipão já estava no WhatsApp aqui falando assim, guarda essa gravação que a gente vai subir essa gravação lá pro Game Design, para a disciplina de Game Design nossa lá, que vai ser muito legal como referência. Muitos alunos, é importante, o professor Lipão me lembrou aqui, que muitos alunos do EAD, né, à tarde eles trabalham, né, e o turno da noite é o que eles conseguem ver as atividades, então provavelmente os alunos do EAD vão ver essa gravação aí, né? Alguns alunos também comentaram comigo que estavam fazendo um curso, então vão assistir a versão gravada. Então, se você está assistindo essa versão gravada aí, gente, não perde tempo, monta o portfólio, faz a submissão, tenho certeza que vai ser, assim, muito bacana para vocês e a gente só tem a agradecer essa parceria, agradecer o Christopher, tá? Acho que, Lipão, acho que eu falei tudo, você quer falar mais alguma coisa?
Eu acabei de ver a Helena no
tá no chat, ela acabou de... ela tá no chat aqui. Eu colei os links lá no chat também, acho que chegou aí para todo mundo. Legal, eu tô lendo ali, o Vitor tá falando que tá economizando já para poder ir para Vancouver Film School. Com esse dólar a 5,6 aí, né, tem que realmente economizar, né?
Deixa eu só abrir um parênteses agora, porque essa semana o dólar caiu, ele estava 4,20, agora ele foi para 3,41.
Então, porque é o dólar canadense, né?
Melhorando. Exato, gente, por favor, não me coloca na mesma bacia do dólar americano, não, por favor.
Oi, gente, legal. Nossa, olha, foi bacana a gente ter tocado nesse ponto aqui, porque, por exemplo, eu mesmo não sabia, eu achava que a conversão era no dólar americano, né? Então,
não,
gente...
sempre dólar canadense.
Bacana.
O pessoal tá pedindo o Twitter do Cris. Cris, is it okay for you to share your Twitter account with us, please?
Yeah, sure thing.
The students are questioning. We are doing StreamYard, but broadcasting to YouTube, so we have a direct link to YouTube, and they are going crazy over there.
Okay.
So
all right, here we go.
please share your Twitter on the private chat. That's cool. Pronto, gente, consegui o Twitter dele.
Eu vou colar lá no chat. Então, acho que para encerrar,
Thank you, Christopher.
Don't worry about it. My pleasure.
Many thanks to talk about game design. In Compton, you see many students of PUC Minas in Vancouver Film School.
Oh, that'd be great.
Daiane, obrigado de novo pela parceria. Professor Lipão pela mediação. E também agradecer novamente, vou trazer aqui o Paulo e o Lucena por terem feito aí a tradução e a transmissão, tá? Muito obrigado. Gente, então, obrigado, nos vemos
Daniel
aí.
Daniel is asking... One second.
Daniel, I was just asking if please you can send us later some of the links you suggested we check. The Richard Garfield talk, and the a website you told us as
yeah,
well. I didn't manage to catch that.
This is probably my favorite design website here by Dan Cook called lostgarden.com. And then Dan, of course, has spoken at many GDCs and whatnot over the years. And
awesome.
his talks there are always fantastic, like genuinely great stuff. And just to make it easy, I'll find that Richard Garfield talk for you because I think it's a phenomenal talk, and it really sort of speaks to the different categories of problems that people can have when they're balancing video games. So it's well worth your time. Yeah.
Is this the one I'm sending here?
Yeah, I just dropped it in the chat here. So
okay, thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Just explaining. Eu só tinha pedido ele para pegar os links para vocês das coisas que a gente não conseguiu pegar durante a tradução. Tava um probleminha de retorno aqui. Aí eu vou pedir os professores para disponibilizarem esses links para vocês, viu?
Ok. Bacana, Luciano. Então, finish?
Nope. Yay!
Aí, obrigado a todo mundo. Gente, fiquem então com Deus. Nos vemos aí nas próximas transmissões. Vancouver Film School vai estar com a gente lá na mostra de jogos, no nosso seja,
Eu vejo vocês na sala do LoL mais tarde. So if you guys playing League of Legends, add me. I'm kidding. I'll see you later.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Cris.
Thanks, Cris.